And today we're just going to run through a relatively short webinar to give you some insight into how Raygun APM is a little bit different to some of the application performance monitoring tools that you may have used in the past. And so one of the things that we are really big on at Raygun, and if you're already a customer, you probably understand this from how we built tools like crash reporting, but we're really big on the belief that modern tools for technical teams should be far more actionable. So traditional APM tools, and in fact, a lot of traditional tools for the tech space, are sort of focused on this idea of giving you some really nice, pretty charts, and you can see if things change in a way that you didn't expect. So maybe a chart dips or it increases, but you don't necessarily know why right away. And then it's on you as the technical person to sort of go and start digging through whether it's log files, APM traces, maybe crash reporting tools, those sorts of things, trying to figure out why did the chart change. And so we wanted to take a different spin on that, which we'll show you today. We often also find that when people have to work with those more legacy tools, that often, as in the slide here, the root causes can be a little bit difficult to see. And sometimes when you're working with these different vendors that are out there, they're more focused on just trying to get you to spend more money. So, you know, put us on more servers, that sort of thing, rather than trying to work with you. So we've always cared deeply about working with technical teams. I think that's just comes from our DNA. I'm a co-founder of the company along with my business partner, Jeremy. We're both, you know, nerds to the core. And so we wanted to build a company that built these sorts of tools and worked in a way that we would want to work with them. And the last point here is we wanted to bring workflow tooling into the APM space. And by that I mean, at the moment, you might put up some TV screens that show you changes are occurring in your software. But once you notice an issue, maybe it's not an issue that you need to deal with right away. Maybe it's something you want to just assign somebody to work on later on, or maybe it is critical and we want to work with it right now. But none of the products that we saw in the market were really addressing the way that modern teams want to work. So we wanted to address all of that with Raygun APM. And so this obviously comes into how we're a little bit different. So we believe in capturing as much data in our APM product as we possibly can. And you'll see that today that it's likely going to provide far more detail than you would expect out of a tool like this. We also talked with a lot of our customers. We have thousands of companies worldwide that rely on Raygun crash reporting and Raygun real user monitoring. And so before we started building our APM product, we went out and we started chatting with those customers about what they saw as issues in the APM space. And a big one that came back to us was that the pricing models sucked. And by that I mean, it wasn't just that the prices got really high, it's just that they didn't really work for the different ways in which people wanted to build software. So for example, if you've got per server pricing, and you decide as an organization to go down the microservices architecture approach, suddenly your APM prices could explode, even though you weren't necessarily using actually much more compute resource. And why should the decision of using, say, lots of smaller instances versus larger instances really impact the price when it's the same amount of data? So we wanted to do something different in there and really support all different software architectures. We also wanted the tools to be smarter. I talked about this under the previous slide. We wanted to kind of have our products act as like a full-time team member who's analyzing what's happening at the code level and informing you about what could be improved and building to-do lists for you, saying, hey, we could go and fix this up. And lastly, that point around workflow again. So we wanted to sprinkle some magic fairy dust across the whole product to make it easier for you as a team to work together. And we also wanted to pull in more data from the different places where data in your organization lives. And the one I'll show off today will be the source code integration so that you can more easily start to see where performance issues lie. Cool. So that's the main bits of my slide deck here. So how do we go about setting up Raygun APM? So if you're an existing Raygun user of crash reporting or RUM, you're probably familiar with the idea that you integrate a small SDK to start reporting data through. It's a little bit different with APM. APM requires us to install a little agent on the server. And what that does is that can then profile the running applications on there and start reporting data through to us. It's a little bit more of a hassle than doing it as an SDK, but I promise you we tried to make sure it would be one of those sort of sub 5-minute setups like we're known for in the other products. And as of today, at the time of recording this, we support the Microsoft .NET Framework-based applications with .NET Core support coming out shortly. And in 2019, we'll be adding support for all of the major languages that are out there. So if you're working with .NET today, you could sign up and try out Raygun APM. Lastly, if you are using services like Azure's websites or Azure Web Apps, which are more of a platform as a service offering, I've great news, which is that Raygun APM does work with that, even though you can't connect to the box. We have an extension that you can install that wires all of that up for you. So we've got all of that covered for you, and the product will just continue to improve and improve and improve over the coming weeks, months, and years. Right, so we'll dive into the actual demo here. I'll just exit the full screen on this and out of there. Cool. So you folks see that all right, Joyce?
Yeah, it looks good.
Cool. So in this demo, I'm going to be looking at an old website that we have, and I'll just explain a couple of concepts here that may be quite familiar for folks if they are already Raygun users, which is we kind of work on the idea of an application. We don't really care day to day about the physical layout. This application could be on 100 servers, it could be on one server, it could be on one server with 50 other applications. Effectively what you do is you just create an app within Raygun that generates an API key, and you could say, I want to monitor this website and plug in the API key. It's pretty straightforward. Then down the sidebar here, you'll see our different products, crash reporting, real user monitoring, and APM with the shiny new button. And because we've had data flowing into this for a little while, I've got this overview tab in here. Now, this is what you kind of get day to day from a lot of the APM vendors in the market now. Pretty graphs, right? Who doesn't love a nice chart or two? So you've got the familiar things in here, your app deck scores, where's the time going on your execution, so how much time is going in my code, how much time is going into database queries, and how much time is going into third-party service calls. Now, the application I'm monitoring today doesn't make a lot of third-party API calls, but it does certainly make a lot of database queries and run code. Similarly, we can get a very quick sort of bird's eye view in here of the execution time of queries. And so you can see here, we're pretty big believers that averages are lies. So we always try, where it makes sense, to present you with a range of percentiles. So we can see here, for example, at the time I've selected over here, that 1% of users are experiencing load times in excess of 374 milliseconds. 50% of users are getting 3 milliseconds or less. And you can really see there how much the average is actually basically a bald-faced lie. We can't really make a decision on that. And that it thinks that, well, it says the average is 54 milliseconds, which sounds a lot more scary than saying, well, 50% of users are actually getting less than 3 milliseconds. So that's why you want distributions in there. That's another thing that we've tried to bring into the APM space, because a lot of the incumbent tools really just focus on averages, which aren't too handy. I won't spend too long on this overview tab. It's built off the same engine as our custom dashboards, which means that you can come in here and customize these. So these are all drag and drop. They're all configurable. You can add different tiles in here, and it's all live data as well. So this will stream along over time as new data becomes available. We won't go into every single one in here, but I do want to show you something that I personally think is very cool. Now, we have our slowest requests in here, but we could see this huge spike, right? I literally had to make the execution speed chart a little bigger to see what's going on. Now, I might go, what the heck happened in here? I can select over that time frame and pivot all the data on the screen around this. You can even see that our app deck score fell during this time. Something went wrong in here, and we can start digging into that right away because we've even got these slow requests here that all align within that time window. We could even keep drilling in further if we wanted to find out what's going on in here. However, that's the approach that you might take with a classic APM tool. And today in this demonstration, I'd like to show you why hopefully you won't have to do so much of that because you're using a modern proactive APM product. Cool. So let's say we were looking into this and we were trying to figure out what happened. I'm just going to change that back to 7 days. The next step you might take is you're going to go and start digging around into request data. And so I've jumped over here. I'm deliberately ignoring the issues for a second. And under the Discover tab, this is where we start looking into perhaps individual requests. Maybe we know we have an issue with a particular method. Maybe we saw something in a stack trace. We can go in and find those. All of these, by the way, are filterable and will adjust the time frame and searchable. But one of the things that I think is really cool in here is we do automatically pick up the database queries that are running. And we chart over time how much time is going in there. Now this one here is an average, but what's quite cool is if I narrow this to one type, in this case SQL Server, let's say we had a spike that occurred. One of the first questions that I've always asked whenever I see a spike in load is this normal or is this an outlier? So an example of this might be, it's 4 o'clock on a Friday afternoon and there's a sudden increase in response time. Well, does that happen every Friday at 4 p.m. or is this an outlier? And so it might be a little bit hard to see in the through a webinar stream here. But you can see here, if I'm resting over this, we'll actually overlay the data between this week, last week, and 2 weeks ago. So trying to give you an idea of, is this an anomaly or is this actually a common behavior? So you can sort of spelunk around inside the Discover section looking for things, which is one way you can approach trying to solve problems using an APM tool. But what we wanted to do was make this a lot smarter. And so this is where the issues come in. And issues are powered by rules, which I'll come back to down there. What this means is that when Raygun's APM product is profiling your web application and streaming data in, we analyze that data based on the rules and we try and give you these work items. So as far as Raygun APM is concerned, we currently have in this website 38 known performance issues. And you can see here, we're smart enough to pick up N+1 queries. We also have some simple rules. I'll actually load these up now while we're talking. So we can pick out, if we're calling external APIs too many times in a single request, we can pick up overall trend things like aptX score changes. The smarter ones, I do quite like the N+1 query support. And then you've got the really basic ones, like, hey, if we do get a trace that takes, say, longer than 3 seconds, so longer than 3 seconds to generate the page, I would like to collect that up into a bucket of work to go and have a look at. And we're planning to continue adding additional rules in here. You can also set up custom rules, but that goes a little bit beyond the scope of today's webinar. So jumping back here, these are all automatically being created. You can see here, we can filter all of these. We can sort by the number of times that they occur. Now, we might look into one of these as well and say, all right, I would actually like to pass this on to Benjamin on our team to dig into so he can assign these issues. So this comes into the workflow side of things. It's not just about pretty charts. It's not just about averages. It's about being able to work as a team to continually improve the quality of our software.
Hey, JD, I have a quick question. If you were to assign that to Ben, will he get a notification from that?
Yes, he will. He'll be told that he's had this issue assigned over to him, and when he comes into Raygun APM, it would be shown under his issues. Fortunately, everybody is smart enough not to have assigned me any issues. Although I will, as a bit of background on this one, Joyce, this site here is probably one of the last major things that I coded on. So nearly all of these issues are actually the CEO's fault. So,
well, it looks like we have to assign all of those to you.
Clearly, I am really bad at writing N+1 queries. But let's say we dig into this and we go, actually, you know what, JD, he was right to have this N+1 query, and I don't want to know about it anymore. So I could actually choose to permanently ignore that, which will kick it out of here. And that means that it takes it out of all of those notification flows as well. So it won't keep barking at you. So maybe if I was smart, we'll leave that. Cool. So that's in a way how Raygun APM is trying to be like that proactive team member of yours that can say, hey, have a look over here. Here's some known issues. So let's dig into one of these. Let's go to this one. So if you can kind of think about the pretty charts at the overview tab as being, say, the 30,000 foot view of your software, this is what I kind of consider the bird's eye view, which is we have this database query. It's happening more than 5 times within a single request. We can see how the trend is over time and what's going on. And so I'm getting a feel now for what's going on in here. But what's really cool, and before I dig in even deeper, because Raygun APM doesn't stop at the bird's eye view. It takes you right down to the atomic level, which I think is really, really neat. But before we jump to that, I just want to highlight, just like within Raygun crash reporting, you can add comments in here. You can mention team members. That'll also notify them. You can throw in your emojis and all of that. And so you can actually have a team conversation about a particular issue. So you're building up that knowledge about this particular problem as a team, which I think is very powerful. But let's say we've seen this N+1 issue and we want to find out more. We'll dig into the actual trace. Now I'm just going to turn this off for a second. This here is what I refer to as being the atomic level information. So what Raygun APM has done is it's tracked the request right down to the method level, right? And so when we've drilled in here, you can actually see the yellow color means it's a database query. This sort of bluey green teal color means it's a known middleware library, and purple means it's our code. And so we can immediately identify here that we can see that these queries all in a row, something's a bit silly here. We could improve this quite easily. You can do a whole lot of stuff with this flame chart. With the mouse wheel, I can zoom in. I might want to find out what's going on in here. I can use the little track bar as well. So I might just say, actually, I'll bring that over here. I could also look at a summary on the side. So this is saying of this particular request that was captured, only 22 milliseconds was my code, 422 milliseconds was spent on database queries, and there were 10 of them. You can also drill in and actually see what was the breakdown of time across those queries. Obviously, in this case here, I could improve this with a simple join. Because what it's doing is it's going off, if I go and actually have a look at that web page, and it's getting the count numbers for the people who have posted in the forum. So there's probably been a handful of people who have posted, and it's just trying to show how many times they've posted. That could also be stored as a lookup value against the user, and that's likely, looking at this, going to potentially bring our execution time down closer to 350 milliseconds. What's neat too is I can click on these queries and I can see the actual query down here, obviously parameterized in .NET, but I can look at all of these. And this is where the integration with your source code kicks in. So if I click on this method here, we actually automatically integrate at the moment with GitHub. We do also have integrations with GitLab and Bitbucket and other source control providers. But I can then see this code. So right within the browser, I don't have to go off and look in my IDE or check on GitHub. I can, if I want, click straight off to GitHub directly from within here. But being able to eyeball that code and see what was going on is super helpful to me as an engineer to identify what sort of work is going to be needed to fix this issue. On top of this view here, what's quite neat, and you may or may not have noticed, is that even as I'm zooming around, it's changing the URL up here as well. So I might be looking at this and go, you know what, I want to ask Jeremy some questions about this. And if I send him that URL, it'll take him to this exact view. So this permalink will even zoom into this point, select the appropriate item, and give him that view in there, which I think is super helpful as well. We do have some other stuff in here, so if you prefer a more classic call tree type view, you can see that. And over time, you can see we can also create issues within your other issue trackers. So for example, if you use Jira more for managing work items, I could spin this up and say, hey, we need to look at the performance of this page because there's an N+1 issue in here that's maybe making the page slower than we'd like. So that's kind of my quick run through. And I personally don't like super long webinars. I just wanted to give you a glimpse though today of how Raygun APM can be used by the team to find out about issues, work as a team together to solve those issues, and how it behaves a lot smarter than a lot of the APM products that are out on the market today. I have two little things though that I would like to touch on before we fully wrap, and then we'll have any questions. One is pricing, right? So everybody wants to know, how do you price these things? What we've done with Raygun APM is we charge on the number of traces. So that means effectively the number of requests that are getting tracked. Okay. So when that data comes through to us, we just count those up. And that's what I mean about supporting things like microservice architectures. If you had 1,000 machines or one giant machine, it really doesn't matter to us about that. But what happens if you've really got a really, really popular application? We want to give you that ability to control that pricing a little bit. So if we jump back over here, there is sampling that can be set up. And so you can see here, I've got this set up to sample one trace every minute for a given unique URL. So I don't need to, if one URL gets hit 10 times in 1 second, I really don't need 10 traces of that. And what's quite nice about this is we've built this right into the web app. So even if you've deployed the agent to 1,000 different machines and you make an update here, you don't then have to go and update the 1,000 different agents. They'll actually check in and pull this information every now and then so that you can adjust it. And where this gets super powerful, of course, is that you may have a relatively low rate of data collection when things are going well. But if you're fighting fires and having issues, you can jump straight in here and dial this up. So you may disable the sampling entirely while you're trying to get a handle on a given issue, and then dial it back down later on once you've got enough data to go and fix the issue in there. Cool. Any questions there, Joyce?
Yeah, I actually did have a couple questions. How would you, I think first question is, say you mentioned if you have thousands of servers, to set up Raygun APM, would you need to download it on every server that you want to track? How would you do that?
Yeah, so you'd need to install the agent software onto each of those different servers. However, and at the moment we target the Windows machine, so we have an MSI for that. Now, MSIs can do support what's it called? Unassisted install or something like that. So you can actually drive those off of off the command line without having to have an interactive session. And secondly, we've also built configuration tools. So there is a little bit of config, like which app pools you want to attach to, what the API keys are, things like that. And that is actually also scriptable as well for folks who want it. However, the default environment setup, which is probably what folks would experience if they give it a first try on their, say, their local dev machine, is a really nice little WPF app that pops up and says, hey, what do you want to attach to? And you can set it up that way. So there's multiple ways you can do this. It certainly supports that sort of more OPSI type distribution model for large numbers of servers. But when you first set it up, it's also got a really nice, easy to follow installation experience as well.
Yeah. I haven't had any issues with a lot of the customers that we currently have that are testing out APM. They said that it's pretty simple once they at least test it out on their test server. Once they download the agent, they haven't had any issues with it.
Yeah, and as you're aware, we put a lot of time into the UX side of things at Raygun. It's always been an opinion of mine that developer tools don't need to make you want to stab yourself in the eyes. So we've worked hard on that. One thing I'd also, I guess I didn't mention a little bit earlier as well, is all of the APM data also fully integrates with our dashboarding product. So you may or may not be aware, if you're a Raygun user, is that we do have these fully interactive dashboards that you can create. They have TV modes, and you'll see in here, for example, there's just way more things you can put in here. So what's our error rate across multiple apps? Maybe I want to track my app decks across multiple apps in one place. It's all live. I want to see how many users are frustrated. I might want to see, what's our actual request. Like, it's interesting actually, because while we have this APM product telling you what's the server been doing, which is super useful, our real user monitoring is also telling you what's the actual user experience. So for example, it very well might be that our web server is responding in, say, 300 milliseconds, but if the user then has to wait 4 seconds for giant JavaScript frameworks to load and actually initialize the page, we don't want to just rely on APM data. And so the Raygun platform actually supports all of those products in one. And if I jump over here, I'm going to show you something a little bit cheeky. Right? So APM, let's say we want 1 million traces a month, $200, or I went for the Raygun platform, $200 a month, same number of traces, except it also includes crash reporting and real user monitoring. And what I find interesting about this is that's $50 extra than monitoring one server with New Relic, right?
Wow.
So it's a pretty phenomenal deal for anybody. In fact, there's every chance we'll put that up eventually. But we just wanted everybody out there to experience a modern APM product, and certainly the Raygun platform is the way to go for that. Cool. Any other questions you've got there, Joyce?
Yeah, if you maybe for some customers who've never used the APM tool, how many traces would they get in a month? Like, how can you estimate that?
Well, firstly, there's a free 14-day trial of our software, so you can set it up and have a look. The best way to estimate is probably just to look at the number of, if it's a web app, for example, how many pages are served. And at the moment, Raygun APM supports only web apps, but we are exploring monitoring backend services, Windows services, those sorts of things. But for today, it's web apps. So if you looked at a page view count, it's probably going to give you a pretty good idea. But again, don't get too worried about that because you do have that control through sampling as well to bring that down and do it. It just means that, and what happens too is, let's say you went along and you picked this one, but you actually went to 1.2 million. We do have controls in there for overages. So in this case, a fraction of a fraction of a fraction of a cent per trace after that. So if you're bouncing around a level, we won't just move you up to the next tier. It'll just basically allow you to go up by a few dollars at a time. And for anybody who's on the webinar that's using other Raygun products, we are thinking about bringing that type of change there to these other products so that folks aren't having to decide about jumping between major price points.
That's really exciting.
Yeah, cool. All right. And I think that might be us, unless there's any other questions you've got there, Joyce.
I don't have any questions. I don't know. Nick, do we have any questions?
Any other ones?
We don't know, but if anybody does have a question, they can email us support@raygun.com.
Well, I've just got a pop-up saying somebody's raised their hand.
Oh,
yes.
We have.
We do.
Now to see if we know how to deal with that.
Well, they go in the Q&A, so hopefully we can type quickly and yeah.
Okay, awesome. Well,
but maybe while we wait for that, a question that often comes up is how do the products kind of integrate together? Like, can you see errors on traces and things like that?
Yeah, absolutely. So our vision has always been that these products should be tightly integrated because we think of these as being like a Venn diagram where crash reporting, real user monitoring, and APM actually have a level of overlap. And in those overlaps are where we can provide unique insight. So for example, one of our goals is that when you're looking at a trace, if there was an exception that occurred in there, you could jump straight from that to the full Raygun crash report and get all of the metadata about the exception to help you fix that bug. Similarly, we haven't got this in there, I don't think, at the moment, but we're looking at it, which is to load the trace data against a crash report. So if you're looking at an error and you actually just wondered about the execution context, you'd be able to have a look at that full trace that's in there. So that's how that works. I think I've got the question up here. Agent for Java, when you implement it, please make it work in such a way that does not require you to change the app startup code. This is more of a request. Well, that's a good request, and to be honest with you, I generally speaking agree with you on that approach. We've often put a lot of time into any of our products to try and minimize how invasive they should be. We don't want you to have to instrument your code like crazy in here. Our usual approach to things is, if possible, by the technology. We want to give you about 80% of the value within, say, 5 to 10 minutes of setup, and that usually means you just put in a little bit of code. Not code into your thing. Maybe you put in a DLL file and you reference it in with a config file, or in the APM case, you install the agent, you attach it to the web server, and then you get most of the value. Then what we like to do is usually have an SDK where you could say, well, I'd actually like to include a little bit more custom data. So maybe I'd like to tag my requests, or maybe I'd like to identify the users, or maybe I'd like to do whatever it is you'd like to do. those sorts of things, that last 20%, that's usually where you will need to make some code changes. But really, at that point, you've usually decided that you're going in on a product decision. Hey, we're going to commit to the Raygun platform. We're going to go with that. And it's less of an issue to then take an extra hour or two to maybe instrument a little bit further and improve the code. So that's certainly going to be our intention with Java. We'll see how we go, though. Appreciate that question. Cool. All right. Sorry, Nick.
We did have another raised hand there, but we can get the question that they want to ask. But
yep, sure. That sounds all good. We'll give it a moment. As Nick said, if there's any other questions that you come up with after this, or perhaps you're watching the recording, you can just send an email to support@raygun.com, or if you're a Raygun customer, we do always have this contact Raygun link in the sidebar, and that will always send a message straight through to the team. And we typically try to get back to people in sub 1 day on pretty much everything. So always feel free to try that out. Cool. Well, I'm not entirely sure that other question's going to come through in time there, so we might want to wrap that one up. But on behalf of Nick, Joyce, and myself, we really appreciate everybody having come along to our webinar today. It was just a glimpse of Raygun APM. Our goal is to run multiple webinars every month, and we'll touch on different pieces, so we might do deeper dives into things. So afterwards, we'd love to hear from anybody on other things Raygun related that you'd like us to make some videos about and have some conversations with you about as well. Cool. All right. Thanks, everybody.